Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for your time to join me today. As Heidi mentioned, I'm I'm actually the chair of the Australian member committee, not chair of the ISO committee, thank goodness. But I'm chair of the Australian committee. I'm also chair of the Asset Management Council in Australia as well. I guess my background by way of introduction. So I've had over 32 years experience in mining, predominantly with BHP. My last role with them was head of asset management for BHP Iron Ore in Western Australia. I left them 5 years ago, and since then I've been consulting as a sole consulting in the area of asset management, from training, auditing, to strategy development and review. So I just want to take you through where we're at with the ISO process at the moment. It's a fairly convoluted process, so I'll try and explain how it all works as we go. So bear with me. There's a lot of acronyms and committees and so on and so forth. So as with yourselves, we do operate under a code of conduct. We are required to put this up at the front of any session. Obviously, dealing with an international community, and you'll see, how many participants there are, and a number from participants from those countries, all with differing views, different backgrounds, different cultures. Then things can get a little heated sometimes, and people have their own views. So the code of conduct is very important for us to anchor the discussions that we have. So there's the standard was developed in early 2000 and was issued in 2014. The document, so that there's 3 documents that form what we call the standard, whilst there is only one standard that we generally acknowledge as what you would certify or comply to, which is 55,001. There's 55,000, which is an overview document, 55,001, which I said is the standard, and then 55,002, which is the guidelines for the application of the standard. It's important to understand that the standard is an asset management system standard. Okay, so I know some people look to it tell them how to do asset management in discrete, and all the elements of that in discrete detail. That's not what it's about. It's a management system standard. And then and some of the discussions we've been having more recently is around people's understanding of what we term the management of assets versus asset management. And there's been a fair amount of discussion in that. So if I refer back to Zoli's previous slide on priorities, asset management comes in as an overarching one on that point 1, whereas the other points are now talking about the management of assets. So whilst asset management is an overarching process that goes across that, the discrete application is primarily in area 1, whereas the other areas are technical aspects of it. So we had our first, so the project was developed, the ISO project went from 2000 to 2014. The committee was called PC 251. And then when it was issued, there was a decision that we needed a technical committee to sort of maintain the standards and develop them as we went forward. And that was called TC 251, Technical Committee 251. And we had our first meeting in Yokohama in Japan in November 2015. Since then, there's been a number of meetings, and I can't remember exactly how many, but there will be coming up to close to 10 now. We try and meet internationally every 6 to 9 months generally, and target countries that are either developing the standard or would benefit from a high level of interest. So it's one of the edicts, or was one of the edicts of ISO, to try and hold the meetings as far around internationally as we could. Obviously, in current times, that's now changed, but we still meet internationally virtually, and work has continued. We have, 7 groups there. There was a typo on the bottom one. So there's a group that looks after the translation. We have what we call a Chairman's Advisory Committee, which is like a filter up front and is made up of the head of delegations. There's a communications group, a product improvement and a revision of 55,000 group. Finance, there's a group looking after the revision of 55,001 and public policy. So the attendance to these meetings varies, but it can be in the 50 to 100 range. And obviously now with the digital, with the meeting virtually, those numbers have increased quite significantly. In terms of certified organisations, so these are organisations that have attained certification in 55,001, and it doesn't distinguish between accredited certification or how that certification was, the validity, I guess, of that certification in terms of accreditation. And we can only pick up where people advertise the fact through their various certification or accreditation bodies. So we do now know that there's just ticked over 300 organisations across the 43 countries. You can see the distributions there. So predominantly the certification sector has been in the utilities area, and transport has been a big group that's picked this up. Mining and oil and gas less so, although we are starting to see a bit more interest from some of the big players in that now. And then certifications by country on the other side. I'm pleased to say that Australia is leading the way on that one, closely followed by Japan. So there's a neat competition between Australia and Japan in that area. And then in the Netherlands is also a very keen follower in there. So you can see on the right-hand side. So what does the future look like for where we are? So you can see here that we've come from 2014, which was when the standard was issued, through to where we are now, just ticked over into 2021. So there's a whole raft of activities that have been going on, and a lot of this at the moment is in preparation to get the design specifications right, understand what the appetite is for change. So we don't sort of think, oh, well, we'll just change the standard now. We actually do survey the market to see whether people think there's going to be a change or needs to be a change. And then there's quite a rigorous process that we actually go through to develop that. And it's what they call committee drafts, which is the very rough draft version of the documents. Then you enter a draft and a final draft. You can see the overlay. I talked before about the international meetings. Here was the plan to meet internationally. So you can see we did have a meeting in Quito in Ecuador. That was the last meeting we had before the pandemic. We neatly had to step around government overthrows and everything for that one, but we avoided the pandemic. The UK meeting was obviously cancelled for that, and most likely the thinking is that certainly for the next year we won't be meeting internationally. So, but virtual is just as good, as I'm sure you're all aware. And probably in this instance, it's starting to sort out the people that are really keen on and committing to working on these standards versus, some elements that thought it was good to travel around the world for. This line here, I'll talk a little bit more about, is the high-level structure. So all management system standards, I'm sure you know now, follow the same structure. So your quality management and environmental management, they have the same, what they call a high-level structure there. That's just in the process of being reviewed. So we have held off deliberately or overlaid the development of 55,001 to see whether there's going to be any major changes to that high-level structure. We're actively involved in that piece of work, but we do need, before we release that standard or start reviewing it, we need to understand if there's any changes in that area. So into the other working groups, as I said, working group 1 is a Spanish translation group. Working group 2 is what we call the chairman's advisory. So it's like the management group for this whole process. Working group 3 looks after communications, and they're an extremely active group and produce or publish some very good material, case studies. They do a newsletter, and all the publications that we do produce, which is starting to increase quite significantly now, that they look after, and they manage that certified organisations piece. There's a link to their website at the end of the presentation where you can get into the whole TC251 work group. So they are a very active group internally. As I said, so they've now got 9 language translations. So they go through and translate these documents. So the language number 9, as they got there, is Swedish. Portuguese are very strong, so we do get a lot of content from those guys, and always chasing case studies. I'm sure that's something that you're aware, benchmarking case studies so people can see the benefits of asset management and why they do it from their own fields. So there are a number of case studies that are kept on record there as well. And if you are a member, you can direct logins, probably not necessarily for yourselves, but again, if you do want access to some of this information, you can come back via me as the representative for global mining in this organisation. Working Group 4, which is a group that I'm actively involved in, we called it product improvement. So there's 4 streams of work that we seek is feedback and external communication. So we interface with other management groups. So there's a lot of work goes on in standards. There's over 45 management system standards. So some of the key ones we liaise with obviously is the quality one. There's been a whole lot of work going on in sustainability and sustainable finance. So we do a lot of work in that area, and we do put out surveys to the organisations to see what people want from the group. Knowledge management. So we're quite keen on keeping track of what we've done in the past. So we learn from the past. People make comments, and obviously this is quite a long cycle of work. So we do need to keep track of that. And the other area, this is probably the key one I look after, is the terminology and definitions for the standards there. So that's quite an involved group to make sure all the publications actually meet, the same definitions, terminology that's inherent in the standards. We have an improvement group. So how do we manage our improvement process? And we're also now looking after the 55,000 update in terms of structure and how that works. So I won't go through this in detail, but basically this is the end-to-end process of how the review works. So we do the design spec, it gets approved by the chairman of advisory group, it goes into working drafts, committee drafts, as I explained before, and there's a check and balance review process all the way through there. So basically 3 key documents: the committee draft document, the draft standard, and then the final draft. By the time it gets to this point, when it's this final draft, this is really just minor editorial changes in here. These are the 2 key documents that all the work is done in this one. This one is really just a final tidy up to make sure there's no significant flaws in it. And the reason, one of these, an anecdotal evidence there of that one, when we developed the standard originally, the original definition of an asset that we created through the whole process and was never challenged was that it was something that can add value to an organization. And as you know now, the definition is item, thing, or entity, because when we did the final draft review, ISO themselves came back, their drafting committee came back and said, you can't use the word something. So that was after 3 years of work and not being challenged, that one got challenged. And what happens, obviously, is if you challenge a definition like that, then you've got to go back and make sure that change doesn't have ramifications back through the whole documentation. So the design spec, which is underway now, we're trying to keep it as 7 pages. It's our work. So what this is for 55,000, which is the overview and guidelines document. The key issue for us here is to keep out, people trying to explain everything in here. It's got to be fairly high level, but supporting of the standard and providing key information that people can look at and go, okay, now I want to know more in this particular area. But it is an overview document, not a detailed manual on how to do asset management, which is a challenge when you put a group of asset management professionals in a room. Working Group 5, so their key products. So this is the finance group. They issued this document, which I did. There was some publications on the website, on the asset management website when we did this. So this is a guidance document on the alignment of financial and non-financial functions in asset management. If you want it now, you have to buy it. One thing that ISO do like to do is they run a very tight publishing housing and copyright over this stuff. So if you want this standard, you have to buy it. I can't give you a copy under the table, unfortunately, and it's not publicly available. So, but it is a very interesting document for those of you that do struggle or do have working in those spaces. There's a number of other things going on in that group now. So they're producing some guideline documents on an asset register, so how to structure an asset register, and some of the work they've done in the past is around decision making and information management that supports into this group. So there's a number of publications that the standards group can put out other than the standards. So there can be technical specifications, guidance note, or just newsletters, and really it's up to the group what level do they want to publish these documents as they go through, and obviously there's different processes to be able to do that. As we talked about the asset register, so you can see that work is being overlaid from 55,010 and then the review process. So they're actually, this is how it's being overlaid into that document. And it's also been obviously a conversation with where does it fit into the review of the standard documents anyway. Working group 6. So this is probably the biggest working group that we have. They're the ones charged with review or an update of the standard itself. And they will be obviously working back into the review of the overview document. So there's a whole heap of inputs here. We talked about the knowledge management register here. There's a whole heap of papers and documents. There's been various discussions around these groups. There's a paper on risk. Then there's also the high-level structure that comes in over here as well. So there's a whole lot of inputs, and this has been worked through into an overarching timeline, which is this one. So you can see here, this is what's been going on. We're now into this space in 2021. So they're doing the design specification, a detailed project plan. That high-level structure is ready in May by all accounts. So we will have that then to be able to start the development of the standard, because we understand what the structure and any definitions or terminology that's come out of that, and then we can structure the standard around that particular document. Working group 7 is a discrete one. They've been looking at public policy. How do we develop public policy? It's probably fair to say this group has been, well, it's been in existence for quite some time and struggled to get to understand what it's trying to produce in terms of requirements of various countries. So you have countries that and you know, like Australia, that is fairly well developed in asset management at a government level. So a lot of the states in Australia have quite a strong view on asset management, and they do adopt or adapt the standard for what they're doing to other countries that really have very low levels of public policy on what they're going to do from an asset management perspective. So this group has been trying to put some guidance notes together around how to do that. It's getting some momentum now. As the interest levels in asset management do increase. So it's pleasing to see that they are making some headway now. And this is basically where they're at. So that they're trying to get it into the end of this year as well. So again, it won't be a standard in terms of what we know it to be. You know, like the 55,001, but it will be a standard in terms of a document that they call that's been issued from the ISO group. And that's it. There's a lot there. I will head off one question that you probably do want to know is so how do you get involved? What is the process for engagement with GMG? So the ISO group is very structured in how people can attend. So if I look at from an Australian point of view, I'm the chair of the Australian group. We can only be members of our own Australian committee, and this is similar worldwide, although some rules are a bit laxer than others. But from an Australian perspective, you can only be a member of the Australian Working Group, MB19, if you are a representative of a national body. We've got people from universities, we've got people from main roads, transport, but they're all national bodies, networks. Not that there can't be individual companies or I guess state-based organisations. So you can't have a group on there that just represents Western Australia. It has to be Australia, and they're quite structured around that. I've had a number of discussions about the fact that I do represent the resource industry, or the mining industry in particular, through Global Mining, because they say, well, that's a global group, not an Australian group. I said, well, you will find that most mining companies are global anyway, so we have to deal with that process. And as chair, I've got a little bit of sway in that one. So I represent yourselves on this group, and I can then channel the information back through the asset management network on the GMG group. The review process, as I was explained, is fairly structured. So a document will get issued, and then there's the opportunity to review and comment on that and publish, and we can run sessions on feedback on those documents. Over the past few years, I have been publishing those documents, but it's probably been a little bit under the radar for a lot of people. So that they have been published with commenting templates, and I have received some, but not much comment on them. And I think this provides now an opportunity to reinvigorate that process as we go forward. So on that note, I think I've taken my time up. I will hand you back. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dave. That was very insightful. And we do have some questions for you if you're willing to take those.
Yeah.
The first question is there any reason why there's a greater interest in certification in utilities than the other industries?
Yes, because the asset management system standard provides, or asset management provides, a high level of governance if it's applied properly. So organisations can manage and govern their assets in a structured way, and the utilities lend themselves to that. Often either private companies providing a service back to a government organisation or a country, or actually run by the country. So there's a demand for a higher level of governance and accountability in those areas. And organisations sort of pick the standard up as being a means of demonstrating that they comply to an aspect of managing the asset base, as much as they would with a quality or an environmental standard.
All right, thank you. Next question for you. Would it be possible for you to outline the benefit to mining sector enterprises of adopting or even just understanding ISO 55000, since in this sector we seem to been struggling with the basics of asset management for decades with little tangible progress?
Yeah, it's a question I've often asked myself. So I think that, so I'll try and answer this succinctly. One of the issues with mining companies is they generally, as an observation, generally operate on a very short life cycle of their asset base. So whilst they will either build a plant for a period of time, and often these plants last a lot longer than they were originally designed for, and then with their mining fleet they'll cycle through and try and extend the life. It's always done based around commodity prices or what I would call a shorter term view. So asset management is managing those assets over the life cycle, and providing the decision making around what you do with those assets based on that life cycle. So I think the two do compromise themselves, whereas a demand to take a longer term view is sort of challenged by that shorter term cycle, which is heavily weighted obviously by a commodity price in most instances as well. And then if you get, and the other an observation of mine would be some of the really big mining companies, the big players, generally will buy their way out of any difficulties. So if they need to replace a truck fleet, they'll replace a truck fleet. It's not a major decision for them. So they're less concerned about whether the decision to overhaul or midlife rebuilds or what to buy, replace, etc., etc. So there's just conflicting views in there. So the benefits I would see that the mining industry can take from that is having a process there for much better data and information gathering to make effective decisions based on a cost benefit, the risk of pushing those assets longer, and the performance that you're going to get from them. So it's a decision-making tool. Having that decision-making available without spending months of researching it. Actually it's there available to make the decisions at the time you need to make those decisions. And as we talked about before, the governance piece there, that that the assets are being looked after properly, so you've got a degree of confidence that the assets are going to continue and not fail, be it from an asset integrity point of view or so on and so forth. And I'm always reminded, and it wasn't a mining organisation, it was a very large city transport organisation that I audited. And at the end of it, I said, I actually interviewed the CEO. I said, so why are you actually certifying yourself? What is it that's pushing you to gain certification as opposed to sort of just doing asset management? And in the end, he said, look, it helps me sleep at night. He said, because I know that the asset base, I know the condition of my assets, I know the costs, I know the future life, and he says it helps me sleep at night. And I thought that was a very succinct way of putting that. And I think if you took that, extrapolated that back into to mining companies, people that look after the maintenance or the board of directors, even in some of the smaller ones, then that's probably a good thought process to think about.
Thank you. One more question. Is the Working Group 4 responsible the standard development through CD, DIS, and FDIS?
So no, so only for 55,000, the overview document, we're doing that one. Working Group 6 is doing the standard itself, but they do follow the same process. There will be a draft issued for comment, and then it goes through that draft process. So where we are at that in that time at the moment is we issued a review process or a request for review to organisations, and I did put that up on the website, which was seeking feedback about what did people think needed to change in the standard. Was there actually a need to change it, or should we just let it go? That process has gone through. The decision has been made now that there is a need to review. It's 6 years since the standard was adopted. There's been some changes. We've learned a lot from the application of it, so it is timely to review. So that decision has been made, and that process will initiate itself once we've got this high-level structure sorted out for a management system standard.
All right. One more question for you. Would you say that the risk-benefit aspect of the ISO 55000 framework, the key differentiating factor in comparison to old-fashioned reliability and maintenance?
Is it different? Probably not. So, the decision is cost, risk, and benefit that we look at, or it drives in that decision-making process. But I think that the asset management system standard sets you up, the thinking around having a strategic asset management plan that provides that linkage. So what is the organisation trying to do, and then what are you trying to achieve from an asset management perspective? And that's translated through the asset management objectives. The asset management plans are a detailed plan of how you are managing that asset base and however you structure that. And that would contain information or relate to information on condition, future use requirements, costs, and so on and so forth, and the risk, and it can take into account risk appetite. So that's where the information is sourced, and a working document, if you like, on how you can take that and make those decisions. And I've seen, again, in organizations, those asset management plans basically become your budgeting document going forward. So you collate your asset management plans and the information from them in terms of costs, and can provide your budget. And then if you know all your risks, then you've got the decision-making tool there for so people, when people come along and say, hey, we need you to cut your budget by 10%, you can go, okay, well, if you cut it by 10%, these are the things we're not going to do, and this is the risk. And here it is documented. So it's quite clear.
All right, thank you very much.